For over 2 centuries now, the United States has flip-flopped between embracing tariffs, which are taxes on imports, and pushing for free trade. In the early days of the Republic, tariffs were welcomed as a critical source of revenue and a shield for budding industries. And at other times, high tariffs stirred fierce opposition, regional conflict, even international retaliation. This love-hate relationship with trade barriers has defined American economic history, sparked political showdowns, and shaped foreign relations. From the tariff debates of 1800s to the free trade agreements of the 1990s, America's stance on tariffs has swung like a pendulum, influenced by shifting economic needs and political ideals. In this video, we'll take a little journey from the nation's first tariff in 1789 through critical moments like the Tariff of Abominations, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, and the creation of NAFTA. So let's see what the consequences of America's ever-changing tariff policy have been. You see, in the Republic's infancy, tariffs were a cornerstone of federal finance and economic strategy. The very first major law passed by Congress was the Tariff Act of 1789. It was signed by President George Washington. This act imposed about a 5% duty on most imported goods, with higher rates on select items like textiles and iron. And it was to raise money for the new government and protect emerging American manufacturers. So at a time when the U.S. had no income tax, such import taxes were essential. From 1790 to 1860, tariffs generated roughly 90% of federal revenue. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton championed tariffs as part of his economic plan. He argued that slightly pricier imports would encourage Americans to buy domestic products and help infant industries grow. However, even in those early years, not everyone loved tariffs. Political leaders like Thomas Jefferson and Southern planters worried that import taxes would raise prices for farmers and invite foreign retaliation. I don't know if that still sounds familiar, but after the War of 1812 essentially exposed America's industrial weaknesses, Congress went ahead and enacted the Tariff of 1816, the first explicitly protective tariff, with duties around 20 to 25% on many manufactured goods. And this was to safeguard fledgling U.S. factories from British competition. So, the stage was set for a recurring debate. Should America protect its producers with high tariffs, or keep tariffs low for the sake of consumers and exporters? And for better or worse, this question would fuel political battles for generations to come, and generations that are still ongoing. So by the late 1820s, tariff tensions boiled over. In 1828, Congress passed a steep protective tariff that northern manufacturers and western farmers cheered, but southern cotton planters despised. This tariff of 1828 raised import duties dramatically, inflating the cost of foreign goods by as much as 50% in some cases. It was so unpopular in the South that outraged opponents branded it the Tariff of Abominations. Southern states, especially South Carolina, argued the high duties helped northern industry at the South's expense, making manufactured goods costly and inviting Britain to potentially retaliate against Southern cotton. The backlash led to a constitutional showdown, known as the Nullification Crisis. Vice President John C. Calhoun, a South Carolinian, anonymously penned the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, arguing that states had the right to nullify federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. After a slightly lower tariff of 1832 failed to mollify critics, South Carolina's legislature boldly nullified both the 1828 and the 1832 tariffs, refusing to enforce them. President Andrew Jackson, though a Southerner, would not tolerate defiance of federal law. He threatened to use force if necessary, backed by Congress's Force Bill of 1833. He said he would use that to collect the tariffs. The standoff was diffused when statesman Henry Clay helped broker the Compromise Tariff of 1833, which provided for gradual annual reductions of tariff rates over the next decade. South Carolina rescinded its nullification after this compromise, averting a deeper crisis, for sure. So the Tariff of Abominations episode proved to be a turning point. It showed how tariffs could ignite regional conflict, and it tested the balance of federal versus state power, all over the question of trade policy. Tariffs remained a hot-button issue into the mid-19th century. In the 1850s, U.S. tariff rates had actually fallen to some of their lowest levels. By 1860, the average tariff was only about 17% on all imports, around 21% on dutiable goods. The southern states, with economies built on exporting cotton and importing manufactured goods, generally favored these low tariffs. The northern states, rapidly industrializing northern states, leaned toward higher tariffs to protect their factories. This sectional divide over tariffs was one of the contributing factors, though not the primary cause, to rising north-south tensions on the eve of the Civil War. When southern states seceded in 1860 to 1861, the balance of power in Congress shifted. With the anti-tariff South, that bloc was gone, so the Republican majority, led by President Abraham Lincoln, a longtime advocate of protective tariffs, he moved quickly to raise import duties. The result was the Morrill Tariff of 1861. This act hiked tariff rates sharply, boosted the average rate of dutiable imports from about 21% to 36% overnight. And that was just the beginning. As the Civil War escalated, the Union passed additional tariff increases and other taxes to help fund the war effort. By 1865, U.S. tariffs averaged 38%, around 48% on taxable items. So roughly back to the lofty levels of the Tariff of Abominations decades, that was from decades earlier. So these wartime tariffs not only raised revenue for the Union, tariff income covered a significant chunk of wartime expenditures, but it also protected northern industries from foreign competition during a critical growth period. The high tariffs didn't end with the Civil War's conclusion. Northern victory cemented the Republican Party's dominance and its pro-tariff stance. And as Lincoln's party famously declared, protective tariffs would encourage home industry and put the cost of government on foreign goods, ensuring that American manufacturers and workers benefited. For the next several decades, after 1865, the U.S. maintained some of the highest tariff rates in its history, ushering in what's often called the high tariff era. By the late 19th century, the United States firmly embraced protectionism. Tariff rates stayed extremely elevated from the post-Civil War period through the turn of the century. Between 1871 and 1913, U.S. tariffs on dutiable imports never dropped below about 38%. In many years, they were considerably higher. For example, the McKinley Tariff of 1890 raised the average import duty to almost 50%, up from 38%. This marked one of the highest tariff peaks in U.S. peacetime history. This policy was intended to shield American factories and workers from European competition during America's industrial boom. Those were boom times. Under the steep tariffs, U.S. industry expanded rapidly, and the economy's growth rate outpaced that of free trading Great Britain, for example. Protectionist champions like Congressman, later President William McKinley, argued tariffs were nurturing the industrial powerhouse America was becoming, crediting them for rising national prosperity. But high tariffs always also had downsides and vocal critics. They meant higher prices and many consumer goods, and that fostered monopolies by reducing foreign competition. Farmers who relied on exporting their crops often opposed tariffs. They feared other countries would retaliate by taxing American agricultural exports. The politics of the Gilded Age frequently revolved around the tariff question. The Republican Party, dominant in the North, stood by protective tariffs as the bulwark of American industrial independence, whereas the Democrats, stronger in the South and among farmers, generally pushed for lower tariffs to reduce consumer costs and expand export markets. In 1894, Democrats in Congress managed to pass the Wilson-Gorman Tariff, trimming rates somewhat, but it only dented the overall high tariff regime. For the most part, the 19th century America kept tariffs at historically elevated levels. A major break in this pattern finally came in 1913. That year, after a Democratic electoral victory, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act. The Underwood Act slashed average tariff rates on manufactured goods from roughly 44% all the way down to 25%. This was a drastic reduction, and it was intended to stimulate trade and lower costs for consumers. To compensate for the lost revenue, Congress concurrently implemented a new federal income tax. This was enabled by the 16th Amendment in 1913. This marked a pivot away from heavy reliance on tariffs. However, the respite from protectionism was short-lived. World War I and its aftermath, it would soon swing the pendulum back toward higher trade barriers in the 1920s. After World War I, the U.S. returned to high tariffs. The Republican-led Congress passed the Fordney-McCumber Tariff in 1922, which restored steep duties on foreign goods, undoing much of the 1913 cuts. By the late 1920s, tariffs were again very high on many products. And then came the Great Depression. In 1929, as the economy started slumping, protectionist pressures mounted once again, particularly from farmers hurt by low crop prices. So, Herbert Hoover had campaigned on aiding farmers with higher tariffs, and Congress took up the cause. What started as a measure to raise tariffs on a few agricultural goods snowballed into across-the-board increases. The result was the infamous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, co-sponsored by Senator Reed Smoot and Congressman Willis Hawley. Smoot-Hawley drastically raised U.S. import taxes on hundreds of products. On average, it boosted already high tariff rates by another 20%, approximately, pushing some duties to record levels. When President Hoover signed it into law in June 1930, many economists and business leaders warned it would backfire. And indeed, other countries retaliated swiftly. Over 20 nations imposed their own high tariffs in response, strangling global commerce. International trade rapidly collapsed, and U.S. imports from and exports to Europe plummeted as foreign markets shut their doors. By 1932, U.S. exports to Europe were just 1/3 of their 1929 value. Worldwide, global trade shrank by roughly 66% between 1929 and 1934. This was a devastating contraction that exacerbated the Great Depression. While economists continue to debate the extent to which Smoot-Hawley caused the Depression versus merely worsened it, there is no doubt that it triggered a vicious cycle of trade wars. The Smoot-Hawley tariff became a symbol of beggar thy neighbor policy. Each nation's attempt to help itself through protection ended up making everyone poorer. Stung by this disaster, U.S. policymakers dramatically reversed course. In 1934, FDR and Congress passed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, the RTAA, empowering the administration to negotiate mutual tariff reductions with other countries, up to 50% cuts without further congressional approval. This innovative approach, trading tariff cuts for access to foreign markets, marked the beginning of a new era. After Smoot-Hawley's turmoil, America was ready to lead the world away from protectionism. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States emerged as an economic superpower with a vested interest in stable, open global trading systems. U.S. leaders remembered how protectionist trade barriers had deepened the Depression and even fueled international tensions. Determined not to repeat those mistakes, the U.S. spearheaded the creation of new institutions to promote free trade. The cornerstone was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. This was signed by 23 nations, including the U.S., in 1947. Under GATT, countries committed to hold periodic negotiations, called rounds, to mutually reduce tariffs and other trade barriers. The results were dramatic. Over the next several decades, successive rounds of GATT talks, from the 1947 Geneva round through the 1970s Tokyo round, and culminating in the 1994 Uruguay round, these all slashed global tariff rates. To illustrate my point, in 1947, the average tariff among major GATT nations was about 22%. By the late 20th century, after many rounds of cuts, the average tariff was around 5%. In other words, tariffs in industrialized countries were brought down to a fraction of their pre-World War II levels. This trade liberalization helped fuel a post-war boom in industrial commerce. World trade grew substantially as markets opened up. The US, with its efficient industries, generally benefited from lower foreign tariffs, which made it easier to export American goods abroad. American consumers also enjoyed cheaper prices as import duties fell. Of course, not everyone cheered the move toward freer trade. Domestic industries facing new foreign competition sometimes pressed to maintain protection. But overall, from 1945 through the 1990s, U.S. policy leaned heavily toward lowering trade barriers. The United States led the establishment of the World Trade Organization. The WTO replaced GATT in 1995 to enforce trade rules and resolve disputes. So, by the end of the 20th century, high tariffs, once a cornerstone of U.S. economic policy, had largely faded. The era of big free trade agreements had arrived, changing the landscape from unilateral tariffs to multilateral deals. The 1990s epitomized America's tilt toward free trade, and also its lingering ambivalence about it. The crowning achievement of this period was the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. This was negotiated by President George H.W. Bush in 1992 and implemented in 1994 under President Bill Clinton. NAFTA created a free trade zone between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, phasing out most tariffs and trade barriers among the three. It built upon an earlier US-Canada Free Trade Pact from 1988, but was unprecedented in bringing a developing country like Mexico into such an agreement with two advanced economies. The goal was to spur economic growth by integrating markets. US manufacturers would gain cheaper inputs and new export markets. Mexico would attract investment and jobs, and consumers across all three countries would benefit from lower prices. So, what happened? NAFTA did significantly boost regional commerce. In the 2 decades after NAFTA's launch, trade between the NAFTA partners skyrocketed, rising from about $290 billion in 1993 to over $1.1 trillion by 2016. Cross-border investment also surged, with U.S. companies increasing their presence in Mexico and vice versa. Economists estimate NAFTA had a modest but positive impact on U.S. economic output, on the order of a fraction of a percent of GDP. But the benefits of freer trade often came dispersed and very subtly. Cheaper goods, new export-related jobs, all this while the costs were concentrated in certain industries. As imports from Mexico and Canada grew, some American factories, especially in industries like autos, textiles, electronics, they lost business or relocated to take advantage of lower wages abroad. So this sparked a backlash that showed the enduring hate side of America's trade policy debate. Critics of NAFTA argued it was to blame for manufacturing job losses and wage stagnation. During the 1992 campaign, third-party candidate Ross Perot famously warned that if NAFTA passed, there would be a giant sucking sound of jobs fleeing the U.S. for Mexico. In the years that followed, organized labor and some economists blamed the agreement for the loss of up to 600,000 U.S. jobs. though others noted overall unemployment didn't spike, and many jobs were created in other sectors. NAFTA's defenders counter that the pact ultimately created more jobs than it displaced by expanding trade, and that the cost of consumer goods was lowered for everyone. Both perspectives had some truth. NAFTA delivered broad economic gains, but also undeniable pain for certain communities. The love-hate split over free trade was alive and well in the 1990s, even as the federal government pursued open markets and public opinion remained divided, much as it had been in the 1820s or the 1880s. So from 1789 to the 1990s, America's tariff policy can be seen as a pendulum swinging between protectionism and free trade. Each swing responded to the pressures of the time, whether raising revenue for a young nation, defending jobs and industries, or fostering global economic cooperation. We've seen tariffs inspire regional rebellions, like South Carolina's nullification attempt in 1832. We've seen them used to build an industrial superpower behind a wall of protection in the late 1800s. And we've seen the country pivot away, championing freer trade after witnessing how beggar thy neighbor tariffs worsened the Great Depression. By the end of the 20th century, tariffs were no longer front and center in policy debates. Having dropped historically low levels on average, they just weren't that important. Yet, the core tension lingered. Americans loved the idea of protecting their own workers, factories, national interests. But they also loved the benefits of open trade, like cheaper goods, new markets. This long love-hate relationship with tariffs has defined U.S. economic history. And even after the 1990s, the debate is far from over, as later disputes and new tariffs in the 21st century would show. The pendulum can always swing again, and I believe it's swinging now. But in the end, understanding America's turbulent history with trade barriers, the tariffs and the turmoil, I think it helps us appreciate the complex trade-offs leaders have grappled with for many generations. It's a story of economic ideals clashing with realities, and of short-term pains versus long-term gains. I suppose it proves that the United States, the battle over tariffs is as old as the nation itself, and undoubtedly, unfortunately, it will continue to shape our future. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, sharing this somewhere, putting a comment below. And if you've stuck around this far, thank you so much. I will see you in the next one.